Welcome to Poets and Poetry. I am Leona Welch, President Emeritus of the Texoma Poetry Society, a chartered chapter of the Poetry Society of Texas. The purpose of this program is to promote and encourage the writing of poetry and to kindle a finer appreciation of this creative language art with introductions to award-winning poets and their poetry. My guest today is certainly that and much more. Author, editor, storyteller, humorist, musician from Austin, Barbara Youngblood Carr. Welcome to Poets and Poetry.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
We have so much to cover and so little time, so let's get started. A native Texan. Where did you grow up?
I was born and raised in Houston and the surrounding areas. I attended first and third grade in a little town called Tomball, which used to be 40 miles away, but now it's a suburb of Houston, of course.
I know Tomball.
Yeah, it's been sucked in. The only claim to fame is that Ernest Tubbs came from there. And he was pretty famous in his own right.
Yeah.
Then I moved up to a town, my dad worked in the oil field, where all the grades were in one room, to a place called Singleton, Texas, which had one little store with a gas station, tanks in the front, and the post office in the back room. And then went back to Tomball for 5th grade, and then moved up to Bowie, Texas, until I graduated high school.
Well, you were traveling before you ever got started, good, weren't you?
That's true. I've moved around a lot.
Okay, your heritage is Native American, and you've published several books about your ancestors. Let's talk about those. How many books are in your series?
When the one is published this year, by the end of September, there will be 5 books in my Ancestor series.
Awesome.
They have interesting titles. Dream Dancing with Ancestors, Counting Places in the Presence of Our Ancestors, Quilted Memories with Our Ancestors, All Roads Lead to Our Ancestors, and the new one will be called Following in Ancestral Footsteps.
Okay, tell me how this came about. Why did you, or when did you decide that you, okay, when and why did you decide you wanted to portray your ancestral heritage?
Well, all the time I was a young child, my father drug us back up in Oklahoma to where he grew up in Peavine Hollow on the Illinois River, up about 13 miles out of Tahlequah. There's the Illinois River, and that's about 38 miles from Muskogee. When you go into the area around the river in Tahlequah, the whole territory changes. It's a magic place. And I didn't like going there when I was a child. You know how we are with your parents. But until I was 15 or 16, they took us there for every vacation. Where my dad showed us where he grew up. We hunted Indian artifacts, and we bathed in the river, and I got very fond of the area as I grew older. Then that became some of my strongest writing when I remembered back about those times. So that's where I'm headed when I leave here tomorrow, back up there where my father grew up. He and my grandfather migrated to Texas when my dad was 20 years old. And then he worked on a ranch until he went to work at Houston Brick and Tile and married my mother, and then his life changed, and I came along. But he was a cowboy when he was young. That's why his picture is on the cover of my book.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, he was a cowboy when he was a young man.
Okay.
But I decided I didn't have enough money to really do books, so someone helped me apply for one of the City of Austin Arts Commission. They called them grants then. They don't now. They just call it the City of Austin Arts Commission funding. But the first time, she asked for a lot of money, $6,700. They gave me about $1,400 or $1,500 to do a poetry book, and said my budget was too big. I need to shop around. So the next year, I wrote it up, and I got a little bit more money. And then I got funded this year for the 5th time. But every year, I do have to fill out forms over. I just turned in forms last Thursday, 2 days ago, for 07, and they're more tedious than ever.
Oh, my word.
They have new people coming in, and they always change the empire. You know how that is.
Well, it's with an everyday, ongoing thing, or I say not an every year an ongoing thing. It's a long-term commitment then.
Yes, and My husband wonders when I beat myself up like I was last week with 17 envelopes full of Xerox copies, you know, and pushing up for deadlines. Why do you do this? He says, I'm a driven woman.
Oh, well.
Technically, that's correct.
Poetry is important to
Because
all of us.
I know that I don't have another 60 years to write the stories that I write. If I don't put them down, they're gone forever.
How many books of poetry have you published?
This one I'm working on will be my 12th book. I started off with a small book called Angels, Monsters, and Other Wild Things. And I'm going to go back and work on that again someday.
Can we find your books in bookstores?
My books are in Hastings bookstores. Your bigger chains like Barnes & Noble don't really handle books by local authors and small-time writers that aren't Harry Potter anymore.
I see.
Unless you pay to put them in a warehouse for another $400 each just to sit on a shelf. You already give a bookstore 40% just to be in the bookstore. So you make absolutely nothing. You don't even get your costs back, barely. My husband helps me fund my books. The city doesn't give me enough money to do a book. Every year, of course, paper goes up, printing goes up. But I do like the company that I work with to print my books. They do good, beautiful books, and they do what I want. Because all my books are full of many archival photographs. Usually about 67. I didn't plan it that way, but counting the cover, it's around 67 or 80. And they also scan them in like I want them around my pieces. And I have had a publisher or two tell me our life would be easier if you would just make all your text on the left margin and scan in no pictures. But I say that isn't what I do, because a lot of my stories are around the picture of the river or my grandfather, and they have to have the picture.
Absolutely.
People like pictures anyway. A lot of people, that's what they like the most.
Yes.
I do have other manuscripts in the works, yes.
That's fantastic. Besides the many, many activities you are involved with, including president, editor of Galaxy of Verse Literary Foundation, I know you are a member of some 12 or 13 poetry performance writing groups.
Too many.
When do you have time to write?
Well, I write when I'm driving down the road, and driving with one hand and writing with the other, making notes. Sometimes. I'm careful. And
okay.
I'm a night person, and I ride a lot at night, and I make a lot of pictures going down the road of joints and animals and dead trees, and I write about things just with sketched notes after.
Do you sometimes work with a tape recorder?
Haven't been doing that very much. I've thought about it, and I tried that one time, but driving and turning that on and off didn't work too well for me. I'd have to get an easier one to use. But my wheels turn all the time, even before I go to bed. I have trouble resting because, as people who ride in the car with me know, everything turns me on. A dead animal, a dead tree that looks like a ghost or something, an old barn, and you never know where you're going to get your ideas. Actually, being creative is a burden, and you understand that. All writers do. Because you never know what's going to tweak you from one minute to the next. An example is I rode a bus once in Washington, D.C., and there weren't any chairs. And a handicapped woman with a hunchback stood up and held on to a strap. And a woman that was beautiful and young stood there and looked. And you could see that her expression was, I'm glad I'm not like that. And so I wrote about it because it struck me as something to write about.
Yeah, oh yes, oh yes. You've traveled many, many years with your military husband.
Almost 30 years, yeah.
Were you active in poetry in that 30-year time span?
I wrote a few poems during that 30-year span. I wrote a lot when I was a teenager because my first fiancé died, and that's what started my creative activities with poetry. Plus, an English teacher encouraged me to be creative, and that gave me something for my pain when I was a teenager. I find that I use that information when I do school workshops with middle school children. They identify with me when I talk to them about that, and they write about their pain, and that's very helpful to many of them. But in the military career, I didn't write again much until he went to Vietnam all year, and then I was up all night worrying and having 3 tiny children and on my own for a year. And I wrote a lot while he was then overseas. But I didn't really start writing a lot until we retired, when I had more time and all the children were gone from home, married, gone to school, whatever.
Empty nest syndrome.
Empty nest. I wrote about the empty nest because one day, on a Sunday, I thought, I can't wait until they're gone. You know, oh boy.
Checkout time is 18.
Yes,
Yes.
and they told me, I can't wait until I'm out of here, you know. But the fact is that the two sons went off to another college on one Sunday afternoon, because where we lived at Fort Hood, they went to a 2-year college. Then they had to go somewhere to finish up. And the day they left for their rest of their 2-year college in Stephenville, my daughter drove off for her 4-year college in Wichita Falls, so they all three left on one afternoon.
Ouch.
And then it hit me on the way home from Stephenville. I started going, boo-hoo-hoo-hoo, and I wrote this little poem, and my husband said, what's the matter? They all left on the same day. There was no attrition there, you know, like one at a time leaving. So she drove off into the sunset, my daughter, and she just said, I'm gone. But the boys wanted us to go with them because they were more mama's babies.
Yeah, I hear you. You said that your husband is also a writer. What's his specialty?
He was going to write when he retired on a definitive book about the Texas frontier regiments during the Civil War, because Texas, a lot of them were Unionists. They didn't want to be on either side, which could cause some of them a problem. So they could be in a frontier regiment to guard the Texans from the Comanches, who came running across from Oklahoma to raid the ranches all the time and kill everybody and take their cattle and their horses. That's where the Comanche moon legends came from, because when there was a Comanche moon, they could see how to come in and steal your horses and ride off, because full moon's just like daylight. And so the Comanche moon is a real thing that really was. And so he started working on that project in retirement, because there was no definitive book about that. But then when he was in that research, he found that some of his great-grandpappies or uncles were in one of those frontier regiments.
Oh.
And so he looked up muster rolls, and he worked a lot at the Barker Library at UT, went down there for many, many days. And then he started into the family genealogy at that point. And he writes very interesting history books about families, because he draws sketches of the little tombstones in the cemeteries. He writes about ginning cotton and picking corn and all that stuff, you know, and living on the farm and weaving, and things about the times that make his books not so dry as just regular history books. About the time he was really into his book about Texas and the frontier regiments, some A&M professor wrote a book, and they called it The Definitive Book About Texas Frontier Regiments During the Civil War.
Oh, no.
And so he said, well, no. I said, no, wait. Your books are different than that guy's book. And what do people that collect Civil War books do? They don't buy one book.
That's right.
They buy 50 books about the Civil War. So I encouraged him to continue with this stuff.
Good for you.
Now, speaking back a minute on moving around with my husband. In Germany, we had many interesting experiences because we lived there for 6 years total. They built the Berlin Wall the first time we went over. They had the worst winter in 50 years, and the Rhine froze solid. And Christmases in Germany are just outstanding. And so I didn't write much while we were there, but after we got home, and lately, I write a lot of really good stories about things that happened to us while we lived overseas. So the military experiences were really great. I grew up in a hometown of 4,000 people, where everybody knew your business, and we all grew up to leave.
Yes.
Unless your daddy owned the hardware store,
Right.
you married there, or you left town. And I was so happy that I had these 23 moves and all these adventures around the world, and didn't have to stay in that little one-horse town and
I love travel.
be the victim of everybody there.
I love travel. We could spend most of our time just naming the many publications where your work can be found, as well as the many honors and awards you've received. But you've recently received one from the military. Tell us about that.
In 2005, I was appointed as the National Poet Laureate for the Military Order of the Purple Heart. Purple Heart veterans are unique in they all have to be wounded in combat. Some people don't know that, so that's why I throw that in. And then I was reappointed in '06 by the new commander. They elect a new commander in Washington, D.C. every year. And how I got to do that was because Austin has the largest chapter of Purple Heart veterans in America because the people who run the organization there work very hard at it. And a couple of the people there knew that I wrote a lot of patriotic, pro-military America flag-waving type stuff. And sometimes my things were published in the Purple Heart newsletter or the magazine. And the commander 2 years ago had the staff in D.C. screen a lot of my poetry and prose, and that was when I got appointed with a certificate that I have framed on the wall. I'm the first one ever, so it's quite an honor. And I'm not a Purple Heart wounded veteran. I'm not an officer. I was appointed by them, which was a special committee. And I have enough of that material that I'm working on a manuscript for several years called Star-Spangled Memories.
Oh, that is awesome.
It has 3 parts. The first one, Star-Spangled Memories, began with being in Germany when they built the Berlin Wall. It was a very scary time, and people over here didn't understand how touchy that really was, but we lived there. And part 2 was written when he was in Vietnam, which it's really a long essay. The title of my book began as an essay. And I got to write part 3 after 9/11 because I didn't intend to do that, but I went to some poetry readings in Austin, which is very polarized, and some people got up and read very rude things about America and military people, and I got part 3. And I won't go into that because I don't do political stuff and I don't like to hear theirs, but my only comment on that is that then I wrote part 3 on my notebook while I listened to them, because the only reason they can stand there and talk like this is because they live here. And it goes back to the freedom purchased for them to the first soldier in the Revolutionary War. But nobody really, they don't understand that. They just are creatures of the moment. And I'd raise my dress up. So I always had a sense of humor in most of those things. And some of my productions at the Hyde Park Theater in Austin have been based around roach stuff about the bugs. And my best attended venues were the Best of Roach poetry, for poetry. But music and theater, yeah, I'm kind of humorous everywhere I go perform.
I'm sure Barbara's going to be sharing some of her roach poetry today, and this is just, I've heard it before, and it's so funny. You're a professional pianist and singer. How long have you been performing?
My mother got my grandfather's old 9-foot upright piano when I was about 9 years old. We lived in this little town, Singleton, I talked about, where all the grades of school were in one room. My father was there for the oil field, and they drove me about 30 or 40 miles every Saturday to Navasota to take piano lessons from this piano teacher who lived in one of these old Victorian houses. And she let people like me learn on the upright. She had a baby grand in the other room for more advanced students. But she decided that I was gifted. And so that's how I started playing piano. But I sang in church and played piano for many years, and I still go to retirement homes and do programs quite often.
Do you play other instruments?
Well, I pick out the guitar once in a while just to sing with, so I can yodel cattle call and do stuff like Wayfaring Stranger.
I am not musically inclined, but I have been trying to teach myself how to play the dobro, and that is it's a little bit beyond me right now.
I would love to learn how to play the banjo and the mandolin, but that may not happen.
Well, and I'm a huge fan of bluegrass music. Anyway, I'm going to a festival this month for a week. Yes.
Where?
Down at Canton.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Bluegrass Festival?
Yes, absolutely.
I do sing with some of my poetry, you know.
I know. I've heard you sing.
I'll probably do a little bit today.
That's great. You're in for a treat, too. Of the many books of poetry published, which is your favorite, your personal favorite?
Probably Dream Dancing with Ancestors, which has my dad on the cover, because there was a whole lot about growing up in there and about where he came from and the beginnings of the family history and Cherokee Native American stuff that I did.
I've heard you say you have several manuscripts just waiting to be published. Do you have anything upcoming?
Well, there's my new city-funded book coming out by October the 1st this year because the string says I have to have it done by the end of
I
September.
see.
Fiscal year, you know.
Deadlines.
Deadlines. I'm working on another one I'm going to try to have published somewhere called Dancing with Dark Places. And that's come about because I do go to a lot of retirement homes, and I see a lot of people with Alzheimer's. I've known many people who have passed away with cancer the last few years, including my brother who died in 2004 with esophageal cancer. He was 4 years younger than me. And we have gotten our middle son back from his wife in his 40 years age because he's a 100% disabled veteran and he has some 100% disability with some mental illness. And he isn't, you know, you don't have to care for him totally, but he has to be on medication. And he lives in some dark places. And so I really thought I was too close to write about this, but the last 2 workshops I've been to, the poetry, you know, Big Humpty workshops at Mary Hardin Baylor, each year I took a poem about his condition, although his name isn't on them, to write to do in the study group for master poetry class. And everybody seemed to think they were written very well, and analogies they hadn't thought about.
That's interesting. I find, for some reason, in going back to some of my poetry and gathering some stuff up recently, I write a lot about death, and I'm not even sure why. It just comes there.
Well,
anyway.
That's dark, and there's a lot about. The darkest poem probably in my book will be one I wrote a long time ago about viewing my parents in the funeral home when they both died together in a car wreck. And it was something people can identify with, but I don't read it in public very often. It's too sad.
It hurts.
But it's very dark.
It hurts.
It's very dark, but it's very vivid, and you can tell.
What is the one thing about you that most people don't know?
I'm shy. No.
No.
Well, actually, I'm sensitive, and I come across as very in charge and not letting people bother me very much. But when somebody says something critical about one of my pieces or says something snide, for example, there was a poetry meeting in Austin one time where it meets every month, and one of the women in one of my other groups and her friend were talking, and it got back to me. You know how that is.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know why the city funds her books. Her writing is so weird. And so then you think, well, if you want to know, ask me. I'll be happy to tell you. And you want to say that next time you see somebody, but you don't.
Yeah, right.
But it's just little things like that. And if I learned to put a protective bubble around myself, I wouldn't have that problem.
There sounds like there might be a poem in that somewhere.
I'm sure I'll get even with them one way or the other. You never know what I'm going to write about.
Okay. What do you hope to leave as your legacy?
Well, one reason that I push and shove to do these books about Native American Cherokee heritage, growing up in the South, Southwest, and Texas, and my youth full of archival photographs back to when I was a baby, and my grandfather and my father taking us to Oklahoma, where he grew up in Peavine Hollow along the Illinois River on a farm. I hope to leave those things as a heritage, not only for other people to enjoy, but for my family to take and keep after I'm gone.
Right.
And maybe some sense of humor if it rubs off on them.
There you go. You can hope, right?
Yeah.
One last question. Who gave you the nickname Texas Tornado?
Well, that came about because about 5 years ago I was in an anthology with 8 other people. It was called Singularities. I never did like the title much because you had to explain it on the flyleaf inside. It's a quantum term of some sort, and I like covers that catch your eye, like Flying with the Eagles or something, you know. But that was a title that was very intellectual. And I was in that book with these 8 people, and one of them was a woman from New Orleans. So we decided to go to New Orleans one year, about 4 years ago, after the book came out, and try to do a book reading there. And I went with her. Well, actually, I flew there and met her there. Her family lives there. She was called the Creole Queen. So we decided at that point to call me the Texas Tornado. So it was a reading of the Creole Queen and the Texas Tornado poet.
Fun.
And so we're still friends, but we don't go do anything together. She's basically kind of quit writing.